"Please, take the cover off," she said. The rancher opened the sack and stood shocked in Wild West Story. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. A rancher who lived with silence, a girl who hid her face beneath a cover, and a land that tested every soul who dared to stay. This is not a tale of heroes, but of small mercies, of breath returned to an empty house, and two strangers who found life again beneath the same western sky. He lived with silence so long, it became his only companion. The sun in the border country never seemed to set gentle. Evening came down quick and harsh, spilling red light over the ridges, turning every speck of dust into a spark from some old fire. Out there, 10 miles past town, stood Eli Ward's cabin. Weather-grayed boards, a sagging porch, shingles that rattled whenever the wind cut across the valley. Eli's life was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in after too many winters. Folks in Dry Hollow remembered him as a man who kept to himself. Younger than he looked, older than he cared to admit. He had buried his wife in a hard winter long ago, and from that day on, he worked his ground alone. No saloon talk, no Sunday gatherings, just him and the land, bound together like horse and saddle. His days ran on rails, worn deep. Rise before first light, feed the stock, mend whatever broke, haul water, patch the corral. Work enough to keep his hands busy, so his mind wouldn't linger too long on what had gone. In the narrow drawer by his bed, he kept one picture, edges curled and faded, of a young woman with a tilted smile. He never set it out in the open. He couldn't stand the thought of those eyes watching him drift through a half-life. Meals were plain and silent. A baked potato, a strip of salt pork, beans if he had them. He ate at the same rough-hewn table where once there had been 2 plates. Now there was only the scrape of his own fork, the hollow sound of swallowing. Sometimes he caught himself wishing for something small. The clink of another spoon, a voice remarking the stew was too salty. He never spoke it out loud. That wish lived quiet, like a stone he carried in his pocket. Evenings, he'd sit on the porch and watch the sky turn black and brilliant with stars. Out here, the heavens stretched so wide it could swallow a man whole. He'd smoke a thin cigarette, listen to the horses shift in the corral, and think of nothing if he could help it. The saddle hanging in the barn still bore the wear of another hand, hers. And every time he brushed past it, he felt the weight of a world that had already left him behind. Neighbors were miles off, and he rarely rode over, not because he disliked company, but because he had no words left for their questions. "How you holding up?" they might ask. He couldn't lie with fine, and the truth was too long to tell. Silence had become his companion. Heavy, yes, but faithful. Morning always came the same. The gray lift of dawn, the pull of the well rope, the creak of boots on frozen boards. Chores lined up like soldiers, and he marched through them without complaint. The land was harsh, but it stayed with him. If he kept moving, the place would hold. If he stopped, it would all fall to ruin, same as a man who gives up. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, a loose shutter would bang, and Eli would wake thinking someone had come through the door. But it was only the wind. He'd lie back down, hand resting on his chest, listening to his heart pound in the silence. That was the truth of it. He feared not gunfire nor rustlers, but the thought that this cabin might never again hold another breath but his own. That was Eli Ward. Not a hero, not a villain, just a man who kept going. And it was that quiet, unspoken wish, for a table not set for one, for a home not hollow with wind, that would soon make him draw his horse to a halt by the roadside, where a figure sat hidden under the cottonwood's shade and changed the course of his days without a single loud word. In Dry Hollow, gossip rode faster than horses, and Eli wanted no part of it. Dry Hollow wasn't much of a town, and maybe that was its only mercy. A handful of weathered storefronts, a saloon that leaned into the wind, a church whose bell had cracked 2 winters back. Folks there lived lean, like the land had whittled them down, same as it had the fence posts. Eli rode in one Tuesday with no real desire to talk to anyone. He needed nails, salt, maybe a sack of flour if the price hadn't jumped again. The sound of his horse's hooves on the plank street drew a few glances, but no greetings. People in Dry Hollow knew better than to bother a man who carried grief like a second shadow. Inside the general store, air hung thick with the smell of kerosene and grain. The shopkeeper gave a nod, nothing more. Eli set a small list on the counter and waited. He had no taste for bargaining, no ear for the town's gossip. His world stretched 6 miles wide back at the ranch and ended at his fence line. Still, a town had a way of pressing itself onto a man. The saloon doors clapped open across the street, letting out a gust of voices, half angry, half weary. A piano struck a sour note, then went silent. Somebody cursed, somebody else laughed too loud. Life, messy and raw, spilled out of those swinging doors like whiskey from a cracked barrel. Eli kept his back to it. He lingered only long enough to check the sharpness of a new spade leaning by the wall. The handle was rough, the iron head already specked with rust. Not worth the coin. He left it and stepped back into the fading daylight, supplies slung over one shoulder. The street was nearly empty, just a boy chasing a stray chicken and a dog too tired to give chase. The preacher's wife swept dust off her porch, though more rolled in with every gust. Life in Dry Hollow was like that. You pushed against the wind, and the wind pushed back harder. Eli mounted up without hurry. He'd never planned to stay long. He wasn't made for the easy lies of bar talk, or for the knowing looks neighbors traded over someone else's troubles. He belonged out past the last hitching post, where silence didn't need explaining. The horse shifted under him as if eager to leave. Eli gave the reins a light tug, and they moved down the road, past shuttered windows and a rusting pump. Town life faded behind him as quick as a smoke trail in wind. Ahead stretched open country, sun falling low, the air already cooling with night. He didn't know yet that 3 miles out, past the split in the road, he'd find something waiting. Not a broken fence, not a stray calf, but a figure, still as stone beneath a cottonwood tree. And though Eli Ward thought he'd left town with nothing more than salt and nails, he was riding straight toward the moment his solitude would break. She sat barefoot in the dust, head wrapped, waiting as if her life had already ended. The sun was dropping hard when Eli reached the split in the road. South led to the border, east back to the long ridgeline. He pulled his reins without thinking, meaning to take the shorter path home, when he noticed a shape under the cottonwood. At first it looked like nothing more than an old sack slumped at the tree's base. But the horse caught the scent of something human and tossed its head. That's when Eli saw it move. A girl sat hunched in the shade, still as stone. Her head was wrapped in a dark shawl, pulled low, so tight it seemed part of her skin. Hands clasped around her knees, bare feet sunk into the dust. She didn't call out, didn't even look up, just sat there, as if waiting for the land to swallow her whole. Eli reined in a few yards away. Dust settled around his boots, and for a moment the only sound was the horse breathing. He felt the weight of that silence pressing heavier than any shout could have. He knew about silence. He had lived with it too long, not to recognize when it meant something was broken deep inside. This girl wore it the way a man wears shackles he can't cut loose. The shawl hid her face, but nothing could hide the way her shoulders trembled with each slow breath. The wind tugged at the edge of the cloth and carried with it the faint, bitter smell of sweat and river water gone stale. Eli sat there a while, rein slack, hat brim pulled low. He wasn't a man to meddle, not since life had taught him how much it could cost to care. But leaving her wasn't any easier. She didn't move when he swung down from the saddle, didn't flinch when his boots hit the ground. He stood close enough to see rope marks dark around her wrists, like bands of shadow burned into pale skin. Still she made no sound, just sat, waiting, as though whatever she'd been told about herself had already taken root, and she believed it. Eli's throat tightened. He thought of nights he'd sat alone at his own table, how the silence had nearly swallowed him whole. And here was another soul, wrapped in the same kind of emptiness, only harsher, crueler. He could have walked on, could have mounted up and ridden home to the safety of loneliness he already knew. Instead, His hand brushed the rough edge of the shawl, stopping short, waiting for any sign she wanted him gone. None came. So he let out a slow breath and said nothing, just held out his hand, not commanding, not pleading, only offering. And after a long, heavy pause, she moved. Barely, but enough to set the story in motion. He didn't ask her name, only led her home, the silence heavier than any question. She didn't take his hand, not exactly. Her fingers only shifted, brushing against his palm for a moment, then falling back to her lap. But it was enough. Enough for Eli to slip the rope of his horse around one hand and stand there until she lifted herself slow from the dirt. The girl moved like a shadow, each step small and unsure. The shawl still clung close around her head, hiding what she carried underneath. Eli said nothing. He'd never been one for questions, and whatever her story was, it clung to her like dust after a storm. He led her to the horse. The mare tossed her head, uneasy at first, but settled when Eli laid a steadying hand along her neck. With a quiet nod, he cupped his hands to give the girl a lift. She hesitated, then climbed into the saddle, the shawl still veiling her face. Eli walked alongside, one hand on the reins, boots scuffing the hard-pan road. The ride home was long and wordless. The valley stretched wide and empty, the horizon painted in bands of purple and gold. Dust rose around their ankles, catching the last of the light. From time to time, Eli glanced up, watching her sit stiff-backed, her bare feet pressed hard against the stirrups as though she expected to be thrown off at any moment. When the cabin finally came into view, squat, plain, and weather-beaten, the girl made no sign, she noticed. No sigh of relief, no shifting of her shoulders. Just the same quiet, as if wherever she was, the silence would follow. Eli tied the horse at the post and gestured toward the porch. She obeyed without a word, her steps dragging as though each board beneath her feet might give way. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and iron. A single lantern lit the table, casting shadows long and crooked along the walls. Eli fetched a tin cup and poured water from the jug. He slid it across the table, then set down half a heel of cornbread, the last scrap from his own supper. She reached with trembling hands. The first sip spilled, running down her chin, and she froze, waiting for something, anger, scorn, a blow that never came. Eli only set a clean rag beside her and turned away to stoke the fire. He gave her space to drink, to eat, to sit in a chair that didn't threaten to vanish from beneath her. That night, he didn't ask her name, didn't ask where she came from, or why she sat under that cottonwood alone. Questions had a way of cutting deeper than they healed. Instead, he kept to his chair by the hearth, listening to the crackle of the logs, while she curled into herself at the far end of the room. Two strangers, bound not by words, but by the weight of silence they both understood too well. For the first time in years, the cabin carried two breaths instead of one. The cabin had always known quiet, but now the quiet carried two sets of breathing. It changed the shape of the air, though neither Eli nor the girl said a word about it. She stayed close to the hearth those first days, shawl still wrapped, hands folded tight in her lap. Eli went about his work as usual, mending a hinge, checking the corral, carrying water from the well, though he found himself listening for sounds inside the house when he stepped back through the door. One evening, he set a small tin plate of beans on the table. She reached for it, slow and clumsy, spilling a few across the boards. Her shoulders tightened like she expected a sharp rebuke. Eli only picked up the fallen beans, dropped them back in the dish, and slid a spoon her way. She stared at him as if that simple act was harder to believe than cruelty. Nights stretched long. Eli took the rocker by the fire, boots planted, eyes on the flames. She would sit across the room, knees tucked beneath the too big shirt he'd left folded on the chair for her. The shirt once belonged to him, years back, but it was clean, and she wore it like a borrowed shield. In the mornings, Eli sometimes caught sight of her at the basin, cupping water to her face with hands that still bore faint rope burns. The water dripped down, darkening the floorboards. She dried quickly, as though ashamed of leaving any trace behind. The smallest things began to stand out. the creak of the floorboards under her light steps, the faint scrape of a chair moved back. Even the sound of her breathing while she slept, curled near the fire, became something Eli noticed, not as a burden, but as proof he wasn't the only living soul in the cabin anymore. One afternoon, while mending tack in the barn, Eli looked up to see her standing in the doorway. She didn't come in, didn't speak, only held the rag he'd left on the table, folded neat, and set it back down where it belonged. Then she slipped away again, shawl brushing the doorframe. It was nothing, a gesture so small it might have gone unseen. But for Eli, it was the first sign that the house had shifted. Not much, just enough to carry another breath, another rhythm, alongside his own. And though neither said a word of it, the silence inside those walls no longer felt quite the same. In the hush of midnight, she whispered, "Please, take the cover off." It was near midnight when the whisper came. The fire had burned low, only embers left, their glow rising and falling like the breath of some sleeping thing. Eli sat in his chair, hat tilted down, half awake, half drifting in that restless place a man lives when sleep won't stay long. Across the room she lay curled on a folded quilt. The shawl still bound her head, shadows hiding what little the lantern had not. For days she'd eaten sparingly, moved carefully, never once loosening the cloth. Eli had wondered, but never asked. Some burdens reveal themselves in their own time, and pressing for them only makes the wound deeper. The cabin was still, except for the wind whirring at the shutters. Then he heard it, soft, almost too faint to catch. "Please take the cover off." His head lifted. For a moment he thought he'd dreamed it. But she was sitting upright now, hands trembling at her lap, voice just a breath above silence. Eli didn't speak. He rose slow, boots scuffing against the plank floor, and crossed to her. Kneeling, he reached for the knot at the back of her neck. His hands were rough, cracked from years of rope and rain, yet he worked the knot gentle, steady, as though afraid the cloth might tear her skin. Thread by thread, the shawl loosened. At last it slipped free, falling into her lap like shed bark from a tree. She kept her eyes down. A face pale from hunger, marked with bruises not yet faded, came into the glow. Her lip was split, her jaw swollen at the edge. Not cursed, not monstrous, just a girl too young to carry so much fear. For a long while, Eli said nothing. He only set the shawl aside, poured water into the tin cup, and placed it near her hands. She lifted it, sipping carefully this time, eyes darting to him as if waiting for judgment. There was none. Eli sat back on his heels, watching the fire catch a log and flare brighter. The room filled with warm light, and for the first time, her face wasn't hidden. He didn't ask her story. He didn't need to. The act of uncovering was enough, and the silence that followed was heavier than words. But it wasn't empty anymore. It was shared. Riders came at dusk, demanding he give her up. Eli stood his ground. Word travels quick in a small town, quicker still when it's sharpened by fear. By the week's end, whispers reached Eli's door, though he hadn't stepped foot in Dry Hollow since he'd brought her home. Folks said he'd taken in a cursed girl, said she'd bring sickness, ruin, maybe worse. He ignored the talk, until one evening the sound of hooves carried across the pasture, not the weary gait of neighbors, but the steady, deliberate beat of men who came with purpose. Eli stepped onto the porch. The sun had dropped low, leaving the sky bruised purple, the air holding its breath. Two riders reined in by the gate, hats low, eyes set. The horses stamped, restless. "We heard you got something that don't belong to you," one of them called, voice flat as dry earth. Eli rested a hand on the post beside him. He didn't answer. The cabin door creaked behind him, and he felt her presence before he saw her. Bare feet on the boards, the faint rustle of cloth. She stepped out, slow, without the shawl this time. Bruises fading, hair hanging loose, her face uncovered in the last light of day. She stood beside Eli, though her hands shook where she gripped the quilt around her shoulders. The men shifted in their saddles. One spat into the dirt. "She's bad luck, Ward. You'll pay for it same as the rest." Eli's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed even. "This land's mine. "Who stays on it, is my say." For a long breath, nothing moved. Dust lifted in the breeze, catching in the slant of fading sun. The girl held her ground, eyes wide but steady. Eli stood with her, shoulders squared, not reaching for his rifle, but making clear enough he didn't need to. The riders waited, then pulled their reins, muttering low. Their horses turned, hooves drumming a retreat that was more promise than surrender. They'd be back, maybe, but not tonight. Eli let the silence settle after they disappeared over the rise. Only then did he look at the girl beside him. Her breathing came fast, but her eyes hadn't left the horizon. She wasn't hiding anymore. And though the danger wasn't gone, the cabin no longer held just his silence. It carried hers too, strong in its own way. Not the silence of fear, but of a stand taken, however small. Two spoons scraped against tin plates, and silence finally felt alive. Morning broke soft after a long night. The riders were gone, their threat left hanging in the dust, but the air still carried a heaviness. Eli rose before the sun, as always, tending to the horses, checking the fence line. When he came back, he stopped short at the sight on his porch rail. The shawl she once hid beneath was tied there, knotted loose, the fabric stirring in the breeze like a flag someone no longer needed to carry. He said nothing, only touched the rail with his hand, then went inside. The cabin smelled different that morning. Faint smoke, a sweetness of beans warming in the pot. She was bent over the small stove, hair falling loose around her shoulders, sleeves rolled back on the shirt he'd given her. Her movements were unsure, but they belonged in the room, as if the walls themselves recognized her now. When she set a plate on the table, her hands trembled. A spoon clinked against tin. Eli pulled out a chair, lowered himself into it, and for the first time in too many years, he wasn't the only one at the table. They ate without words. Beans, a crust of bread, water poured from the jug. Nothing grand, nothing a stranger would call a feast. Yet Eli noticed how the room sounded different. The scrape of two spoons instead of one, the faint catch of her breath when she swallowed. Once she spilled a bit onto the table, flinched, and looked at him as if braced for anger. He only reached for the rag, wiped the spill away, and set the spoon back in her hand. Her eyes lingered on him then, not long, but long enough. When the meal was done, she gathered the dishes, rinsed them at the basin. Eli leaned back in his chair, watching the steam rise off the tin plates. The fire popped, and the smell of beans still clung to the room. It was the smallest thing, a shared meal, a pot simmering on the stove. But for Eli, it filled a space he'd thought was gone for good. The cabin had another breath inside it now, and the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was alive. Not heroes, not saints, just two souls, no longer ghosts, beneath the same sky. Days passed without measure. The riders never came back, though Eli kept his rifle close, more out of habit than fear. The girl, she still hadn't told him her name, began to move through the cabin with a sureness that hadn't been there before. She fetched water from the well, swept the floor with the old broom, even stepped into the yard to scatter grain for the chickens. Eli worked the fields, but his eyes drifted to the house more often than they once had. Smoke from the chimney no longer marked only his own supper. There was another rhythm inside those walls now, steady as a second heartbeat. One evening, after hauling a feed barrel to the barn, Eli found her standing by the fence line. The same rail where she'd tied her shawl still held it, though now the cloth was bleached by sun, frayed by wind. She touched it lightly with her fingers, then let it fall, watching the fabric stir in the dust. "I don't need it anymore," she said softly, almost to herself. Eli didn't answer. He didn't need to. That night, supper was plain. Beans again, with a heel of bread. But they ate facing each other, firelight flickering against the walls. And when the silence settled after the meal, it felt warm, not hollow. Later, Eli sat on the porch, the night wide and star-filled above him. She stepped out too, barefoot, quilt around her shoulders, and lowered herself onto the step beside him. For a long while, neither spoke. The sound of crickets, the creak of the boards, the steady rhythm of two people breathing in the same air, it was enough. Eli thought of the years behind him, the nights filled with nothing but his own shadow. He thought of the girl beside him now, once hidden, now uncovered. Neither of them whole, not yet, maybe not ever. But here, still here. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of sage across the valley. Eli leaned back in his chair, the rifle resting easy by the door, and let the silence hold them both. It wasn't a story that ended with vows or promises, nor did it need to. It ended with two people, no longer ghosts, sharing the same porch under the same sky. And that was more than enough. Out on the plains, stories don't end with trumpets or triumph. They settle like dust after a long ride, soft and quiet, leaving behind only what matters. For Eli and the girl, it wasn't about victory, nor about erasing the scars they carried. It was about finding breath again, where silence once smothered, about setting a plate at the table and knowing someone else would sit across from you. The West was harsh, but it could also heal, not by grand miracles, but by small mercies, a hand extended, a meal shared, a life no longer lived alone. And maybe that's all any of us ever need. Not perfection, not answers, just enough kindness to remind us we still belong here. If this story touched a quiet corner of your heart, share what it stirred in you. Sometimes, a few honest words in the open are the same as lifting a heavy cover we've carried too long.